Thank you, Miley. Appreciate that very much. Okay, we're going to start today. So part of the employee assistance program is doing lunch and learn type presentations. We do these for individual departments or work groups. We also do these for some of our external companies, and then obviously we do them on a bi-monthly basis within Ascension. So I appreciate very much you spending your lunchtime with me. I'm probably going to be together about 40 minutes. I do want to let you know that I am recording this presentation. Your participation in your chat is not part of the recording, but my presentation part is, just so that you know that. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about COVID. And I know for a lot of us, that's sort of a dirty word that we really are sick and tired of talking about. I guess I'm taking a little risk in that I want to look at some of the things that we've learned in this time, a little bit of good and a little bit of bad. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that this has been a time of great loss for many of us, and I don't want to in any way minimize that. We've had some loss of life for sure, but there has also been other great losses. Like, for example, life is never going to be the same as it was prior to COVID. So for some of us, maybe that's a little bit of a loss of innocence or a loss of naivete. Definitely things changed in terms of the way education used to be and the way work used to look and how we used to think about healthcare. There's been a lot of changes in that while they're not a loss like death, they are something that we grieve, that things will never quite be the same, and we kind of miss them in the way that they were. I want to challenge today, though, that in the midst of what was dumped on us in COVID time, there came about a lot of opportunity for us to rethink some things. And I think even in the short run, we've already gained some new perspectives, and definitely in the longer run, some things that we might want to do a little differently. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about some of the diamonds that have come out of the rubble. Some of the things that we have learned generally in years since the pandemic or during, what have we been forced to realize, some of those positive things, and hopefully how we've grown. And also trusting that all things are ultimately used for good, and that we figure out and become better in adversity. So one of the first things that we've learned is that hygiene is good and respectful. And for many of us, we've probably known that all along, but we have all observed those times when people don't practice good hand washing, or people that have been not so conscientious regarding their own symptoms and sharing them with other people. So I think there's been an excellent reminder that just in general, we need to be careful about transfer of germs, and that taking care of ourselves when we're sick, making sure that we're washing our hands, and staying home when we don't need to be at work or we don't need to be at school. I think historically we've had a lot of times where people push through, and I think there was even a culture that encouraged that even if you're sick, you should still go to work. And sometimes we even patted ourselves on the back because we came when we didn't feel good. And often that meant that if the adults had to go to work, then that meant that we pushed our kids to go to school or to daycare or wherever they needed to go, because we needed to have a place for them to go. So realizing that sometimes rest is really just the best medicine. And that definitely masks reduce infection. And I've seen a lot of people being conscientious about wearing masks, even when they're not concerned about COVID, just because they've recently possibly been exposed, or because they've been exposed to strep, or they just have a common cold. And it's just conscientious and good practice. Another thing that came to the forefront is that we need to work on public trust, acceptance, and cooperation. And so early on, I think in COVID, there was definitely a feeling of we're all going to come together and we're going to fight this. We're going to figure it out. If you remember, there were a lot of people who stepped out to start making masks, and that there were lots of efforts to figure out how are we going to manage this in our communities, and people became very creative in our schools and in other ways that we could figure out how life can still go on and help each other in this time. Unfortunately, when people become afraid, things begin to deteriorate. And some of the things that happened at that point is that people began to distrust. And we began to distrust some things in healthcare. We definitely began to distrust our leaders and some of our people in public office. So being able to recognize that people act in extreme ways when they're scared. And so as a healthcare organization, as any sort of public organization, we need to remember how much trust we're really called to bring to the public and why that's so important for us to build upon. Another thing that came about in COVID was that virtual meetings in healthcare are the new normal. And I see this as a huge positive. We have definitely reduced a lot of barriers to healthcare. Perhaps many of you have utilized online connections with your nurse or your doctor, or there's a lot of visits that have happened virtually that have saved you from having to go into a doctor appointment. This has been particularly awesome for people who live in more remote areas, or if there is a transportation barrier of some sort. I know that in my work, there has been a lot of cut down on running around, going to meetings in person that really probably didn't need to be in person. So I think we're a lot more efficient in our time. And we think like, is this something we could do over the phone? Is this something we could do virtually? Or is this something that needs to be done in person? So I think that we've become much more efficient overall. I think that we had a huge learning curve in the terms of tech savviness. So like many of you, we were sort of knowing how to do virtual meetings, but we were all pushed into having to know how to do it. We become pretty adept at navigating in a virtual world. Hopefully, we've also been able to promote a better work-life balance, because there's been a lot of jobs that either have been created specifically to be remote or have been redefined as being partially remote or as the option of being remote that used to be in person. And this option is allowing a lot of people to have a better work-life balance. So for example, staying home and working if you have a sick kid, so that they don't have to go to daycare, that you can be with them when they're sick, and also that you can still maintain your job. And just a shout out right now to healthcare providers and public safety professionals, and especially teachers in this time. One thing is that when things get difficult, we see that those people who have been called to serve definitely have stepped up, and that always remains to be true. And recognizing that those people didn't have the option to not do their job during the time of COVID. And some of us had that luxury of being able to be remote, or to be able to not have to be in a high risk situation. But healthcare providers and public personnel, public health people, all needed to step up and to be able to do that, and to just acknowledge the amazing work that they do on a regular basis, the fact that they risk their personal lives to do that. We've learned that online education is an option, and it can be really awesome in some ways, but it can also be really debilitating. So I don't know about you, but when we were in COVID, one of the things that happened is that my kids were doing school at home. And I learned a lot about what my kids were doing in school at that point. And I think I stayed pretty involved, but I really learned a lot about what they were learning, how they were learning it, and how they were excelling and how they were struggling. There were some really great things that happened in that time. But for a lot of students, this was a huge time of struggle. So some of the things that we've learned is that, school is way more than just learning math, for example. The whole environment and the social piece that happens in school is so important to learning at all levels. And so it's been wonderful that education has become more flexible, especially in higher education. For some people, the ability to do school on your own pace, at your own time, in your own home has been fabulous. And again, has allowed some people to go back to school or to further their education that would not have been able to before. So definitely a time and a place. But we also know that during COVID time, there were people that really didn't do well. And some of those pieces were because of socioeconomic barriers, that people didn't have access to technology. They didn't have access to supportive environments where learning could occur. That they didn't have that social connection that is huge for a lot of people to be able to learn, is to have that conversation and interaction with other students as well as with the instructor. And unfortunately, we saw some behaviors of persons having too much technology time, and we've kind of coined this term of being zoomed out, that there's only so much screen time that is really conducive to good learning. And especially for younger students, that was really difficult. And that whole social aspect of what happens in school is definitely lacking. So one thing to take away from this is how important it is for us to shut down technology sometimes. We need to put down our phones and actually have a conversation with someone where we look them in the eye and fully listen to them. We need to have some time where we can have other sorts of entertainment. We know that we sometimes are missing out on what's happening right in front of us if we're too absorbed in our technology. We also know that getting too absorbed in social media and news is not helpful to us. And so being able to set some healthy boundaries about where and when this is a helpful thing for us. That not all communication should happen electronically. We know that tech can be a real help, but there are times where a face-to-face meeting, where picking up the phone and actually talking to someone versus emailing or chatting with them is really the preferred way. A big takeaway from the COVID time is that we need to take mental health seriously. And obviously, I feel very passionately about this, but I hope that this time is really underscored for just the general public on how important this really is. Unfortunately, in the time of COVID and since, anxiety is higher than it has ever been historically. We know that isolation in general obviously increased during the time of COVID and has continued as people have felt more depressed, they felt more hopeless, and it's gotten worse sometimes with the misinformation or the stress, and the fact that just so many people really feel lonely, whether they're isolated or not. Sometimes the worst loneliness happens when people are surrounded by other people. Unfortunately, another piece of this is that suicide is the second leading cause of death among 10 to 14-year-olds. And this is shocking to think about children that are this young, that this has become such a prevalent issue for us. And I think it's been building for some time, but finally it's been brought to the forefront. And communities and schools are finally very seriously taking suicide prevention and incorporating it into their curriculum. And it's becoming more and more easy for people to seek out help. We know that online access to help is good, but we still don't have enough mental health professionals. We don't have enough psychiatrists or nurses. We don't have enough counselors, or we don't have the access to it that people need. And unfortunately, for those people who have emergency situations with mental health, we don't have enough capacity in our inpatient units or in our crisis response to keep up with it. So learning that anybody is susceptible to mental health problems. There are a lot of people that didn't really struggle with any sort of anxiety or depression prior to COVID who now have had an experience of that. And it's very scary, but it's also very leveling, hopefully, to understand that we can all experience that sometime and that help is available. We know that our environment and our routine play a huge role in that. We need to remain active. We need to be physically healthy. We need to be out and be social. We cannot just be by ourselves or look at the same four walls every day. And we know that we need to have a variety of coping skills. Through COVID, we have learned that we have a great capacity for resilience. So in our suffering, we led to a great feeling of solidarity and resolve. And to recognize that this is not the first time that this has occurred, but when we as a nation or as a collective group have encountered challenges, generally people will step up and rise to the occasion and become better because of the situation that happened. So think about the enormous changes that happened in healthcare in general and how now we are looking at contagion very differently on being able to contain it, just public health in general, that our emergency services stepped up in great ways to be able to minister to people in the community, to calm a lot of fears, to get people the help that they needed despite all the limitations. So many food and shelter services that stepped up, recognizing that people maybe didn't have a job for a time or didn't even have access to the places where they used to be getting food or food support. Situations, for example, with kids who, when they were in school, had access to food services that they didn't when they weren't in school. So people were able to step up and to fill that gap. A lot of faith-based communities that found ways to, again, administer to people that were shut in, to figure out the gaps in either financial means or housing or food. All of the community businesses that figured out, how do we do business while this COVID thing is happening? How do we keep everybody safe? How do we do things online? How do we do home delivery? How do we do access where we can put it in a contained box and then you can come and pick it up and we don't have any people contact? All of the people with financial advantages and the scientific communities that stepped up to try to figure out what is going on and how do we help this from a medicine aspect and from a prevention aspect. And just look at how we all figured out the new normal, how for a while it seemed just completely overwhelming. And then we very quickly began to adjust. And we started to figure out how we can get our groceries online and how we could get our prescriptions delivered to home. And we remembered that there were other ways that we could engage with each other. And I just always thought it was interesting how puzzles and board games and books all of a sudden became back into vogue, which was really great for these industries, but also to remind us that there are downtime and there's other ways that we need to relax and that we can engage with each other that we probably hadn't done for a long time. We took a lot of time to be at home. So obviously we did some artistic things, we cleaned out some closets, and we definitely have pushed ourselves, I think, to continue to look at how all of this affected people differently. And are there some major gaps that are happening in healthcare and education that have always been there that we need to look at differently? So recognizing that when we have times of discomfort or when we have things that are really difficult, if you think about in your own personal life, times where you had a challenge or something that you had to overcome, in the short run, obviously it's very painful and it's awkward and it's something that we would like to avoid. But in the long run, we generally find that we have grown and that we have learned to do things differently. So pushing ourselves beyond our comfort zone and recognizing that being comfortable and being happy is not the goal as much as the byproduct of trying to push ourselves to be better. We know that when we have a little bit of anxiety, when we have a little bit of excitement, and we're forced to look at change and forced to look at need, that we rise above. And I love the statement that necessity is the mother of invention. And we think about that all the time, the ways that we figure things out because we have to, not because we necessarily wanted to. Also recognizing that change is really hard for a lot of us, and that overwhelmingly people would prefer that things sort of stay the same, but that there are great opportunities to change and to grow and to become better. And that we're not the first generation that has had to struggle with a nationwide or a worldwide crisis of either pandemic or war or depression, or limitations, and how much we can learn from the good things that have happened in our past, but also the mistakes that we've made in the past, so that we don't repeat bad patterns, but we learn from good ones, and those pieces of wisdom that we can take from other generations that have gone through really difficult things. One thing that we've learned in COVID is that humans need to live in community, and that tech doesn't cut it. So if you think of all of the ways that we've been able to figure out how to have those virtual meetings and those virtual doctor appointments and whatever, and those are really great. But we also know that people are, by nature, we need to be in community with each other. That having just texting conversations or being able even to talk on FaceTime is not the same, and it makes it very difficult for us to build connection. Going back to that need for students to be physically in school and in proximity with their teacher and with their fellow students, that there is no substitute for that human connection that happens in proximity and also in physical touch. The value of being able to give a hug, to give a handshake, is part of who we are, and that we need to recognize the limitations of virtual, and that it does not fit all needs and all purposes. We also recognize that there is a time for stillness and for gratitude. We were forced to, with some of our downtime and not being able to do all the things that filled our calendar, to actually have some downtime. And for a lot of people, it was very anxiety making. They really didn't know what to do with themselves. And people got very antsy. I remember the time where people were joking about taking their dogs for walks, 6-8 times a day, because they just really didn't know what else to do with themselves. I think we as a people are struggling with the ability to hold still and to be quiet with ourselves. There's a lot of benefits to us to be able to reflect, to calm ourselves, to be creative and think more clearly when we don't have all of either the actual physical noise of surroundings or the physical noise of going in our life, or the internal noise of things that happen when we don't slow down. And recognizing that having an attitude of gratitude can really foster a lot of good things. So again, nothing that we struggled with in COVID was something that we asked for, or that I wouldn't say is something that was good in and of itself. But from that, we cannot help but step back and take some inventory of ourselves. So realizing, for example, those people that we know and we love, that, life is precious and we don't ever know when things will change, when will be the last time that we're going to see them. That the time we spend together to be able to give a hug or to share birthdays together or things like that, they're precious, and that we need to appreciate them for what they are. Being able to slow down and to pay attention to what is it that we're doing, because when we keep track of the busyness of jobs and activities and everything else, when it came down to the point of us thinking we could die or our friends and family could die in this situation, did those really matter? Were they priorities for us? So focusing on the little things, not the materialistic or a lot of the day-to-day sort of things that we get upset about or we chase after. Trying to avoid an overload of negativity in the media or in other situations, that trying to keep that good balance, that we can easily get pulled down into that feeling of despair and hopelessness, and we need to guard ourselves against that. Obviously, to be able to connect with friends and family and to see some growth opportunities where they exist. So this is going to continue in our lives, that there will be challenges that come into our lives that we did not ask for, that we resent, that are really overwhelming at a certain time. But what are the opportunities in here? Are there ways that we can learn from how others have managed it? And can we surprise ourselves with the strength that actually we have, of what we can bring forward in those challenging times, as well as the strengths of others? I am hoping that you realized who your people are, who your friends and family are, that really step up and are there for you when you need them, when you're struggling in a difficult time. And obviously focusing on how much we are alike in our, very basic needs of each other, how fear and overwhelm can happen to each of us. How mental health is something that we all need to focus on. So this was just a little review today of some of the reflections of things that we have learned during COVID. Some of them, we have a long way to go. We have a lot to do to figure out our healthcare system, to figure out education, to figure out how we're going to continue to meet the needs of people with mental health struggles. But we've also learned a ton, and we've learned some perspective and some valuable lessons. If you're continuing to struggle with some of the aftermath of COVID, whether it be kids that are still struggling in school, or perhaps you adjusting to work at home or going back into the office, or other relationship issues that are causing you to have some difficulty, please consider reaching out to the Employee Assistance Program. The Employee Assistance Program is a counseling program. It's a short-term program that's available to you and every member of your household. It does not go through insurance. There is no cost to you. It's completely confidential, which means that what we talk about in session is completely confidential, but it's also confidential, meaning that no one within your work group, your boss, no one else knows that you're utilizing the service. It's completely private. So it's a way that you can also work through some work struggles, or maybe a problem that you're having with your boss or coworker, any of those things. Or if you have other questions on how we can help you, if you, for example, have a person in your family that's struggling with mental health and is looking for some resources, we also have a lot of access to helping you get connected in your community in different services that might be covered by your insurance. So I thank you very much for your time today. I hope that I gave you a few things to think about. And I look forward to other Lunch and Learns coming, and the next one will be in June. Thank you and have a great day.